The room smelled like leather chairs and someone else's ambition. It was a Tuesday in March, the 14th. I remember because I'd had a 7 a.m. call with my attorney that morning and hadn't eaten anything since. The conference room was on the 9th floor of a glass building on Main Boulevard, Goulburg. Floor-to-ceiling windows. A long mahogany table that seated 14. A projector screen at the far end cycling through slides I had not been sent in advance. I was sitting in chair 11. Not at the head. Not near the head. 11, the second from the end, closest to the door, which I think was intentional in a way nobody would ever admit out loud. There were 12 people in that room. 8 of them shared my last name. I had a notepad in front of me. A pen. A glass of water nobody had poured for me. I'd gotten it myself from the credenza when I walked in, because no one had offered, and I have never been the kind of woman who waits to be offered things she can simply go and get. The meeting had been running for 40 minutes. It was a formal equity restructuring presentation, the kind of meeting that determines who owns what, who gets paid what, and who, going forward, even gets a seat at the table. 2 outside investors had flown in from Islamabad. Suits. Briefcases. The kind of men who ask very precise questions and write down the answers. At the 41-minute mark, one of them, the shorter one, Mr. Farouk, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, looked up from his papers and asked a question that was completely routine. Standard due diligence, he said. And the silent equity vehicle, NR Capital, who are we actually dealing with there? Is there an active principal? My uncle Tariq, sitting at the head of the table in a charcoal suit he'd had made in Dubai, didn't even pause. Nobody's significant, he said. A legacy arrangement. Dormant, for all practical purposes. And then my cousin Zain, 31 years old, had never filed a tax return without his father's accountant holding his hand, leaned toward Mr. Farouk with the easy confidence of someone who has never once been questioned in a room, and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, honestly, we've never even had a real conversation with whoever's behind it. It's basically a ghost. 3 people laughed. One of them was my cousin Bilal. One of them was my uncle's business partner. One of them was a man whose entire presence in that room had been funded, indirectly, by decisions I made with my own money in 2019. I looked down at my notepad. I had written 2 things on it since the meeting started. The first was a question I'd meant to ask about the depreciation schedule on the Farazipa Road property. The second was a number I'd written almost absently, the way you write something you've known so long it lives in your hand before your brain. 34.7%. I drew a small, clean box around it. I did not look up. I did not smile. I took a slow sip of the water I had poured for myself, and I let the laughter run its course, and I thought about something my attorney had said to me at 7 a.m. that morning, before the eggs I hadn't eaten, before the drive up Canal Road, before I walked into this building and sat in chair 11 like a guest in a house with my name on the deed. He had said, Nadia, whenever you're ready, just say the word. What they didn't know, what none of the 12 people in that room knew, including the 2 men from Islamabad with their briefcases and their very precise questions, was that the floor we were sitting on, the lease, the holding company that owned the lease, and a third of everything they were so confidently restructuring without me, had my name on the paperwork. The ghost was already in the room. She just hadn't decided to speak yet. My name is Nadia Raymond. I am 34 years old. I drink my coffee black, I keep my apartment very clean, and I have never once in my professional life sent an email I regretted. I tell you that not to sound impressive. I tell you that because it matters to understanding everything that comes after. I grew up in Karachi Defense Housing Authority, Phase 5, in a house that was comfortable but never extravagant. My father was a mid-level civil engineer who believed, with a faith that was almost spiritual, in 2 things: education and documentation. He kept every receipt, every contract, every letter from every institution in labeled files in a steel cabinet in his study. When I was 9, he showed me how compound interest worked on a piece of graph paper. When I was 14, he handed me my first copy of a property title deed and made me read every line. He died when I was 22. Heart attack. Sudden. The kind that doesn't give you a Tuesday to prepare. He left me 800,000 rupees in a savings account, a steel cabinet full of labeled files, and the single most useful thing anyone has ever given me, the habit of reading the fine print before I sign anything. Ever. I moved to Lahore at 26 for a corporate position at a mid-sized asset management firm. Junior analyst. Salary: 85,000 rupees a month. I lived in a one-bedroom in Johor town, cooked most of my meals, took the office van when it made sense, and saved with the kind of quiet aggression that people who grow up financially uncertain tend to develop without anyone teaching them to. By 29, I had my first serious investment position. By 31, I had registered NR Capital Private Limited, a private holding entity, my name, my framework, my terms. Nothing dramatic. No press release. No LinkedIn announcement. Just a company number, a registered address, a legal structure, and a very clear sense of what I was building and why. Now, my relationship to the family business. Uncle Tariq is my father's older brother. He built Raymond Textile Exports in 2002 out of genuine hard work. I will say that clearly because it's true and because fairness matters to me even when it isn't returned. By 2015, it had evolved into a broader holding group. 3 commercial properties, 2 warehouse facilities, a logistics subsidiary, real assets, real value. In 2019, through a structured private arrangement, documented, filed, completely legal, NR Capital acquired a 34.7% equity stake in the holding group's primary vehicle. The family needed capital. I had capital. The arrangement suited everyone. The difference was that only 2 people in the family knew it was me behind NR Capital. One of them was Uncle Tariq. The other was a cousin who has since moved to Canada and stayed wisely quiet. Tariq knew. He had always known. Which is the part that made everything that came later not just insulting but deliberate. I didn't hide my identity to be secretive. I structured it the way I did because I had watched this family operate for long enough to know exactly what they would do with the information if they had it too early. They would have asked for more. They would have renegotiated. They would have treated the investment like a family loan, something soft, something emotional, something they could revisit at a dinner table and reshape with guilt. I didn't want a seat at that dinner table. I wanted a seat at the one they hadn't built yet. So I waited. I stayed quiet. I showed up to weddings and Eid dinners and the occasional family gathering where I was introduced as Tariq's niece, the serious one, the one who works in finance, very dedicated, hasn't gotten married yet. You know how these career women are. I smiled. I ate the food. I drove home alone. And I let them think they knew exactly who I was. Here is something nobody tells you about being the quietly competent one in a Pakistani family. The competence becomes invisible the moment it stops being immediately useful to someone else. You are seen when they need you. You are furniture when they don't. I had watched this dynamic operate in my family for over a decade before I ever put a rupee into Tariq's holding group. I understood it the way you understand weather in a city you've lived in long enough, not with surprise, but with a kind of tired, calibrated awareness. You know which months flood. You know which relatives will call only when something is on fire. You dress accordingly. But understanding a pattern doesn't make it hurt less when it lands directly on you. And over 11 years, it landed on me more times than I ever said out loud to anyone. Let me tell you about 3 of them. The first time was 2017. Bilal's wedding. The big one. The one the family had been planning for 18 months, the one with the marquee in the garden and the catering from a hotel in Clifton, and the guest list that my Aunt Roxana revised approximately 47 times. I had flown in from Lahore, taken 2 days off work, brought a gift that cost me 45,000 rupees, a proper gift, not an envelope because I had learned by then that in this family envelopes get forgotten, but objects get displayed. It was the second night. The walima. I was standing near the dessert table with a plate of kheer. I hadn't started eating yet when I heard my Uncle Tariq's voice carrying across the courtyard. He was talking to a man I didn't recognize, someone's business contact. I gathered, an older gentleman in a white shalwar kameez who was nodding with the attentiveness of someone being networked. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. The courtyard wasn't large. Tariq's voice has always been built for projection. He was describing his family. Going through the children, the cousins, the achievers. Bilal, brilliant boy, stepping into the business. Zain, sharp, learning fast. Then the man asked about the rest of the family. Any others in business? And Tariq said, I can still hear the exact register of it, the casual, almost fond dismissal. There's Nadia, my brother's daughter. She works in finance. Runs numbers for someone else's company. She's not really a business person, more of an employee type, you understand. Very dedicated, very steady, but not someone who takes risks. The man nodded. They moved on. I stood there with my plate of kheer, and I thought. I had closed my second private investment deal 4 days before this wedding. I had wired 6.2 million rupees of my own capital into a commercial property position in Lahore, while simultaneously sitting in a due diligence call for a third opportunity. I had done this quietly, alone, without a family safety net, without a father to co-sign anything, without the network of uncles and contacts and borrowed credibility that Bilal and Zain had moved through their entire lives like water through an open pipe. Not someone who takes risks. I finished the kheer. It was very good kheer. I put my plate down and I went and danced at my cousin's wedding because it was his night, and he had nothing to do with what his father said, and I am not the kind of person who lets someone else's smallness ruin a good song. But I remembered it. I remember everything. That is, I think, both my greatest professional asset and the thing that makes me occasionally very difficult to be in a room with. The second time was 2019. And this one wasn't careless. This one was calculated. The holding group had a warehouse acquisition on the table. A facility near Sundar Industrial Estate, 14,000 square feet, solid location, the kind of asset that makes sense if you have the liquidity to move quickly and the patience to hold. The deal required bridge financing. 18 million rupees. Needed within 21 days, or the seller walked. The family didn't have it liquid. They had assets, but the assets were tied. Tariq had already spoken to 2 banks, and neither could move fast enough. My cousin Hira, Tariq's daughter, the only one in that family who has ever spoken to me like a full human being, called me on a Wednesday evening. She wasn't calling on behalf of her father, she said carefully. She was just calling to ask if I knew anyone. Any contact. Any lender, any private financier, anyone who moved in those circles. I knew immediately what was happening. Tariq needed the money. Tariq couldn't bring himself to ask me directly, because asking me directly would have required acknowledging that I existed in a professional capacity, and that acknowledgement would have cost him something he wasn't willing to spend. So he sent Hira, with a soft ask, wrapped in plausible deniability. I could have said no. I could have said I'd ask around. I could have let the deal collapse and watched from Lahore with my morning coffee. Instead, and I have thought about this decision many times since, I arranged the financing personally. Through a contact I had built over 3 years of showing up consistently and doing what I said I would do. I structured it cleanly, moved quickly, and the bridge was in place within 11 days. The warehouse deal closed. The family acquired the asset that is today worth, conservatively, 31 million rupees more than they paid for it. You know who they thanked? They thanked my contact. They assumed he had acted independently, as a favor to the family name. At the signing dinner, yes, there was a signing dinner. Tariq loved a signing dinner. My name was not mentioned once. I know this because Hira called me afterward, quietly mortified, and told me. She said, "Nadia, I'm sorry. I told Baba it was you. He said to thank your network." My network. As though I were a telephone exchange. As though the relationships I had spent years building through competence and reliability were a utility anyone could dial into, consequence-free, credit-free. I told Hira it was fine. It was not fine. But I was still keeping score on paper, not out loud. The third time was 2021. And this one crossed a line that the other 2 had only approached. There was a shareholders' meeting. Formal. Registered. For the primary holding vehicle, the same entity in which NR Capital held its 34.7% stake. The agenda I later obtained included a proposal to restructure internal equity ratios and revalue asset contributions. I was not informed of the meeting. Not informally. Not through Hira. Not through any channel. I found out it had happened because I had set a quiet alert on the holding company's SEC filing activity, something my attorney had suggested years earlier as routine practice for any entity I held a stake in. The alert flagged a post-meeting resolution filing 3 days after the fact. I called my attorney. He pulled the filing. The meeting minutes listed the shareholders present. NR Capital was listed, but listed as represented by proxy. No response to notice. No response to notice. They had sent a notice to an address. An old registered address for NR Capital that had not been the active address for 14 months. An address I had updated with the SECP the previous year through a standard change of registered office filing. The update was on record. Any competent secretary checking the current filing would have seen it immediately. The meeting proceeded without me. The resolution passed. The equity ratios were adjusted internally in a way that, on paper, marginally diluted NR Capital's effective economic position without technically crossing the threshold that would require my signature. They had done their homework. I will give them that. They had found the exact millimeter of legal gray space, and they had stepped into it with both feet. I sat with that for a few days. I didn't call anyone. I didn't send an email. I opened a new folder on my desktop. I labeled it with the date. I started putting documents in it. Because here is what 11 years of being underestimated teaches you if you're paying attention. People who dismiss you stop being careful around you. They stop double-checking. They stop anticipating. They make small errors, filing errors, address errors, disclosure errors because they genuinely do not believe you are watching. They think the ghost doesn't take notes. I take meticulous notes. And by late 2021, I had 3 years of them, organized, labeled, cross-referenced, stored in 2 locations, reviewed quarterly with my attorney. I had the 2019 bridge financing on record. I had the meeting notice sent to the wrong address. I had every SECP filing, every resolution, every internal document that had ever passed through the holding company's registered office. I had been patient because I believed in giving people room to be better than their worst instincts. I had been quiet because silence deployed correctly is not weakness, it is positioning. But that boardroom in March, Chair 11, the laughter, nobody significant, basically a ghost, that was the moment I understood that the room had been made. The trap had been walked into. Not by me, by them. That should have been the end of my patience. It was. Let me take you back to that Tuesday in March. Properly this time. Because I gave you the ending of that meeting in Chapter 1. The laugh, the notepad, the number in the box. But I didn't give you the full weight of what it felt like to sit in that room for 2 hours as a woman who had been invited, essentially as wallpaper. The meeting had been called by Tarek under the heading of a strategic alignment session, his language, which I had learned over the years, meant, I have already decided what I'm doing, and this meeting exists to make it look collaborative. The email invitation had come through Hira, forwarded to me with a small note. Baba wants family there. You don't have to say anything, just come. Just come. Just sit. Just exist quietly in the corner of a room where your money built 2 of the 4 agenda items being discussed. I came. I sat. I existed. The 2 investors from Islamabad, Mr. Farouk and his colleague, a taller man named Mr. Sethi, who wore a watch I recognized as a reference-only Rolex that had not been available in Pakistan through any official channel, arrived 7 minutes late and immediately commanded the room in the way that men with serious capital tend to do. Not loudly, just weightily. The kind of presence that makes other people in the room sit slightly straighter without realizing they're doing it. Tarek was warm with them, practiced. He had clearly met them at least once before. There was the easy shorthand of men who have already had one dinner together. Zain sat to Tarek's left, dressed better than usual, hair combed with an intentionality that suggested he'd been told this meeting mattered. Bilal was across from him, laptop open, performing diligence. I was in chair 11 with my notepad and my water, and 11 years of context that nobody in the room was aware I was carrying. The first 40 minutes were standard. Tarek walked through the asset portfolio, properties, valuations, yield projections. Zain presented the logistics subsidiary numbers, reading from slides that I could tell from the formatting had been prepared by someone else. Mr. Farouk asked 3 very good questions. Mr. Sethi asked one extraordinary one about the depreciation treatment on the Farazipur Road warehouse that made Bilal visibly pause before answering. I wrote the question down because it was the right question and I appreciated it. Then they got to the equity structure slide. It was a clean chart. Professionally made, they had hired someone for this, not used an internal template. Pie chart, labeled segments. Tarek, 41%. Bilal and Zayn combined family trust, 22%. Two smaller family positions, 2.3% total. And then in a gray segment, smaller than the others, tucked between two labeled slices like something the designer had been asked to minimize. NR Capital Private Limited, Legacy Vehicle, 34.7%. No name, no principal, no description beyond those two words, Legacy Vehicle. 34.7% described as a legacy vehicle. That is the largest single minority stake in the room. That is a stake that, at the valuation being discussed in that meeting, 340 million rupees, represents 117.98 million rupees of economic interest. 117,980,000 rupees. Described on a slide in gray font as a legacy vehicle, positioned visually to look like a footnote. I looked at that slide for a long time. Then Mr. Farouk pushed his glasses up and asked his routine due diligence question. And the silent equity vehicle, NR Capital, who are we actually dealing with there? Is there an active principal? Tariq said, nobody significant. A legacy arrangement. Dormant, for all practical purposes. And I want you to understand something about that sentence. Tariq knew. He had known since 2019 exactly who NR Capital was. He had sat across from my attorney at a table in Karachi and signed documents that named me as the principal. He had my phone number. He had, in fact, called me on my birthday in January, 2 months before this meeting, and spoken to me for 6 minutes about nothing in particular, the way people do when they are maintaining a surface without investing in the depth below it. Nobody's significant. He said it without blinking, without a pause, without even the small physical tell, a shifted glance, a cleared throat, that people sometimes produce when they say something they know is wrong. He said it with the smooth confidence of a man who had decided, somewhere along the way, that I had forfeited my significance by being too quiet for too long. And then Zayn leaned in with his comment about the ghost, and the table laughed, and I looked down at my notepad. I wrote the number.
Drew the box around it.
And then, and this is the part one haven't told anyone, not even Hira, I wrote one more thing underneath it. Small. In the margin. Day 1. Because that was what it was. Not the end of my patience. The beginning of something else entirely, something that didn't have a name yet but had a very clear shape. The shape of a woman who has spent 11 years being careful, who has the documents to prove it, who has an attorney on speed dial, and who has just been called a ghost by a man sitting inside a building she partially owns. I stayed for the rest of the meeting. Another 40 minutes. I did not speak. I did not change my expression. I refilled my water glass once. When it ended, I shook hands with Mr. Farouk and Mr. Sethi, both of whom would, within 3 weeks, receive a very different introduction to who I was. I said goodbye to Bilal. I nodded to Tariq, who smiled at me with the uncomplicated warmth of a man who believes everything went exactly according to plan. I took the elevator down alone. In the lobby, I called my attorney. He picked up on the second ring. I said, Assad, I'm ready. Pull everything. He said, I'll start tonight. I walked out onto Main Boulevard. The March air was dry and sharp. I stood on the pavement for a moment, not dramatically. I wasn't in a film, just standing, the way you stand when you've just made a decision that you know is going to change the specific geometry of your life. Then I got in my car. I drove home to Gulberg. I made dinner. I went to sleep at a reasonable hour. The ghost had a plan now. Assad Mirza has been my corporate attorney for 4 years. He is 41, precise to the point of being occasionally exhausting, and he has never once in our professional relationship told me what I wanted to hear when the truth was more useful. These are, in my opinion, the only qualities that actually matter in a lawyer. He called me the next morning at 8:47 a.m. I was on my second coffee, sitting at my desk at home, already in work mode. He didn't open with pleasantries. He said, Nadia, before I tell you what I found, I need you to understand that what I'm about to describe is worse than negligence. This was not accidental. I put my coffee down. Tell me, I said. He told me. It started with the SECP filings, The Securities and Exchange Commission of Pakistan maintains public records for all registered companies, and Assad had spent the previous evening pulling every document filed under the holding group's registration number for the past 24 months. What he found, when laid out in sequence, was not a single dramatic smoking gun. It was something more insidious than that. It was a pattern, small, incremental, carefully constructed, of paperwork that had been designed to quietly and legally minimize NR Capital's visible footprint within the holding structure. The first thing he flagged was the Form A filing from 14 months ago. Form A is an annual return, standard, mandatory, lists the company's shareholders, their stakes, their details. The Form A filed for the holding group 14 months ago listed NR Capital correctly in terms of percentage. But in the field for nature of shareholding, a classification field that affects how the stake is treated in certain regulatory contexts, someone had changed the designation from strategic investor to dormant legacy vehicle. One field.
For words changed.
It sounds small. It isn't. That reclassification had downstream effects on how NR Capital's stake was weighted in the internal governance documents. Specifically, it had been used to justify excluding NR Capital from the quorum calculation for the 2021 shareholders meeting I was never properly notified about. A dormant vehicle, under the holding company's own articles of association, did not count toward quorum. A strategic investor did. They had changed 4 words in a form to make my stake legally ignorable at a meeting where they restructured the company's internal equity ratios. That's the foundation, Assad said. Now here's the structure built on top of it. The 2021 meeting, the one I'd found out about through the filing alert, the one where the notice had been sent to my old address, had passed 2 internal resolutions. The first was a revaluation of asset contributions, which on the surface was routine accounting. But the methodology they used for the revaluation had been quietly changed from the one specified in the original shareholder agreement, the one I had signed in 2019. The original agreement specified an independent third-party valuation for any asset revaluation affecting equity ratios. The 2021 resolution used an internal assessment prepared by Bilal. Bilal, who had no independent valuation certification. Bilal, whose assessment, surprise, valued Tariq's original asset contributions at approximately 23% higher than a market-rate independent valuation would have, which mathematically compressed every other stakeholder's relative position, including mine. The second resolution from that meeting had established a new internal management fee structure, a monthly operational charge levied against the holding vehicle's revenues before distribution. The fee was payable to a services company. I asked Assad, who owned the services company. He paused for exactly 2 seconds, the Assad Mirza version of a dramatic beat, and said, Zain registered it 8 months before the meeting. I was quiet for a moment. So they revalued the assets using Bilal's numbers to compress my stake, I said slowly, and then they created a fee structure that extracts revenue from the holding vehicle before it reaches distributions, and the fee goes to a company Zain owns. Correct, Assad said. And none of this required my signature because they reclassified me as dormant. Correct. And the restructuring they're planning with Farouk and Sethi, the 340 million rupees deal, would finalize the new equity framework, Assad said, and bring in outside capital under terms that treat NR Capital's stake as a legacy minority position with no governance rights and limited economic participation. Once that deal closes, unwinding it becomes significantly more complex and expensive. I stood up from my desk. I walked to the window. Outside, Gulberg was doing its usual Tuesday morning things. Traffic, a vendor with a cart, 2 men arguing pleasantly outside a chai dhaba across the street. Ordinary, unhurried life. I thought about my father's steel cabinet, the labeled files, the graph paper with the compound interest calculations. I thought about him telling me more than once that the most dangerous thing you can do in any agreement is allow the other party to define your terms for you. Read everything, he used to say, especially the parts that seem routine, especially those. They had read everything. I will give them that. They had constructed this carefully, over years, with patience I hadn't expected from people who had always seemed to me too comfortable to be truly strategic. I had underestimated their desperation. That was my error, and I owned it. But here is what they had not counted on. They had not counted on the original 2019 shareholder agreement, the one signed in Karachi, with Tariq across the table and my attorney beside me, containing a clause in Section 7, subsection C, that I had insisted on, and that Tariq's lawyer at the time had tried twice to soften and ultimately failed to remove. The clause stated, and I am paraphrasing from memory, though I have read it enough times that the paraphrase is essentially verbatim, that any reclassification of NR Capital's shareholder status, any amendment to the valuation methodology governing equity ratios, and any introduction of fee structures affecting pre-distribution revenues required written consent from NR Capital's principal. Not notice, not opportunity to object. Written consent. They had done all three without it. Every single move they had made over the past 3 years, the Form A reclassification, the 2021 resolutions, Zain Services Company, the new equity framework being presented to Farouk and Sethi, was built on a foundation that was in direct contractual breach of a document that had Tariq's signature on page 11 and his initials on every subsequent page, including the one with Section 7, subsection C. I turned away from the window.
Assad, I said.
How quickly can you file an objection with the SECP? I drafted it last night, he said. I was waiting for you to say go. I almost smiled. Almost.
Go, I said.
That was the moment everything shifted. Not the boardroom. Not the laugh. Not the word ghost. This quiet Wednesday morning conversation, this stack of documents, this clause on page 11, this was where the story actually turned. Because what they had built over 3 years with patience and careful paperwork, I was going to dismantle with patience and better paperwork. They had made one fundamental miscalculation. The kind that is very easy to make when you have spent 11 years assuming that the person you are dealing with is not really paying attention. I was always paying attention. I had just been waiting for the right moment to prove it. I want to be clear about something before I walk you through what happened next. I was not angry in the way that people expect when they hear a story like this. I was not shaking. I was not crying in my car or calling my friends or posting cryptic things on my WhatsApp status at midnight. I have seen what anger does to otherwise intelligent people in high-stakes situations. It makes them move too fast, talk too much, and hand the other side exactly the ammunition needed to reframe the narrative. Angry people make mistakes. Calm people make moves. I was very, very calm. And I had a great deal to do. The first thing I did was nothing. For exactly 48 hours after my call with Assad, I did not contact a single family member. I did not change my behavior in any visible way. I went to work. I answered emails. I had lunch with a colleague on Thursday and talked about a completely unrelated property opportunity in Baria town that I was evaluating. I watered my plants. I slept adequately. This was not passivity. This was intelligence gathering time, the 48 hours in which Assad and I built the complete picture before we touched a single piece of the structure. You do not move on a chessboard until you can see the full game. I had learned this from watching other people move too early and lose positions they didn't need to lose. On Thursday evening, Assad sent me a consolidated brief. 41 pages. Every filing, every resolution, every discrepancy, every contractual breach mapped against the specific clause it violated. He had color-coded it. Red for clear breach, amber for strong arguable breach, green for contextual documentation. There was almost no green. I read it twice. I made notes in the margins. I slept on it. Friday morning we moved. Step 1. The SECP objection filing. Assad filed a formal objection with the Securities and Exchange Commission of Pakistan flagging material misrepresentation in the holding company's recent annual returns, specifically the reclassification of NR Capital's shareholder status without principal consent, and the post-meeting resolutions passed at a meeting for which proper notice had not been served to an active shareholder. The SECP objection did several things simultaneously. It created an official regulatory record of the dispute. It triggered a mandatory review process that the holding company could not quietly sidestep. And, most critically, it placed an automatic procedural hold on any major structural changes to the company's registered equity framework while the review was active, which meant the 340 million rupees restructuring deal with Farouk and Sethi could not close. Not next week. Not next month. Not until the SECP review was resolved or withdrawn. Assad filed at 9:15 a.m. He sent me the confirmation timestamp at 9:22. I was in the middle of a completely unrelated conference call when the notification came through on my phone. I read it, set the phone face down on my desk, and continued the call. Step 2. The investor contact. This one required care. I was not trying to blow up the deal out of spite. I want to be precise about that because my motivations matter to me even when no one else is watching. I was not trying to destroy the company or damage the family's reputation in the market. I was trying to ensure that two serious investors did not commit capital to a structure that had an unresolved material shareholder dispute sitting inside it like a fracture in a load-bearing wall. They deserved to know. Frankly, their due diligence should have found it, but that was their problem, not my obligation. I drafted the communication myself. Assad reviewed it. We went through 4 versions over 2 hours on Friday afternoon, cutting anything that was emotional, anything that was accusatory beyond what the documents plainly showed, anything that could be characterized as an attempt to interfere with a commercial transaction for personal reasons. The final version was 3 paragraphs. Professional. Precise. I introduced myself as the active principal of NR Capital Private Limited, holder of a 34.7% equity stake in the holding vehicle currently under discussion. I noted that a formal regulatory objection had been filed with the SECP regarding certain structural matters within the company. I suggested, without drama, that they may wish to pause their process pending resolution of the outstanding matters and offered to make myself available for a direct conversation at their convenience. I enclosed 4 documents as attachments: the original 2019 shareholder agreement with Section 7 subsection C highlighted, the SECP objection filing confirmation, the Form A showing the unauthorized reclassification, and NR Capital's current SECP registration showing me as active principal. I sent it to Mr. Farouk's business email, which was publicly listed on his firm's website, at 4:47 p.m. on Friday. I copied Assad. I copied no one else. I did not send a copy to Tariq. I did not warn anyone the email was coming. I did not give anyone the opportunity to get ahead of it with a counter-narrative before the investors had read the documents themselves. Step 3. The formal legal notice. On Monday morning, Assad dispatched a formal legal notice to the holding company's registered address, the correct current address, not the old one they'd used to ghost NR Capital in 2021. The notice outlined the contractual breaches in detail, cited the specific clauses violated, and formally demanded a response within 21 days as required under the shareholder agreement's dispute resolution provisions. The notice also formally requested, in writing, full access to all board minutes, resolutions, and financial records from the past 36 months, a right explicitly preserved for all shareholders above a 10% stake under the original agreement, a right that had never been offered to me and that I had never previously needed to invoke because I had been building my file through other means. Demanding the documents officially served 2 purposes. First, it created a legal obligation to produce them. Refusal or obstruction would itself become evidence. Second, it told them, without ambiguity, the precise scope of what I already knew. When your opposition receives a document request that maps exactly onto the decisions they believed were invisible, the psychological effect is significant. It tells them, she has been watching. She's been watching for a long time, and she knows where to look. The notice was delivered by courier at 11:30 a.m. on Monday. Assad told me later that the courier reported the office receptionist had read the header, gone pale, and immediately picked up the phone. Step 4. Silence. I did nothing else. I made no calls. I sent no messages. I did not reach out to Hira, though I knew she would be caught in the middle of whatever was happening inside that office, and I genuinely felt for her. I did not contact Bilal or Zain. I did not call Tariq. I went about my week. I had 3 other investment positions to monitor. I had a call with a property consultant in Islamabad about something completely unrelated to any of this. I cooked. I read. I went for a walk along the canal on Tuesday evening when the air was cool enough to make it worthwhile. My phone, during this time, was remarkably active. Tariq called on Wednesday. Once in the morning, twice in the afternoon, once at 8:47 p.m. I let all four go to voicemail. He left a message on the third call. I listened to it once. His voice was controlled, but I could hear the specific quality underneath the control, the slightly too careful enunciation of a man who is choosing every word because he knows the call might matter later. He said he thought there had been a misunderstanding. He said he'd always valued my involvement. He said he hoped we could speak before things became unnecessarily complicated. Unnecessarily complicated. As though complication were something I had introduced into a situation that had been, until my inconvenient objection, perfectly orderly. Zayn called once on Thursday and did not leave a message. Bilal sent a WhatsApp message on Thursday evening. It said, "Nadia, API, can we talk?" I assumed he meant Api, the respectful term, older sister. He had never called me that before in his life. I noted the shift. I did not respond. Mr. Farouk's office called Assad on Thursday morning. They had read the documents. They were pausing the process, pending clarification. They were, Mr. Farouk's associate said carefully, interested in understanding the full shareholder picture before proceeding further. Assad thanked them, confirmed that NR Capital's principal was available for a direct conversation at an appropriate time, and ended the call. He texted me immediately after. "Investors have paused. They want to talk to you directly." I read the message during a break between two other calls. I typed back, "Good. Let them wait until next week. Schedule nothing before Wednesday." Because here is the thing about leverage. It does not diminish with time when the underlying documents are solid. Every day that passed without the deal closing was a day that cost the family more, in investor confidence, in legal fees, in the compounding anxiety of not knowing exactly what I had and exactly what I was going to do with it. I already had everything I needed. I had had it for years, really. I had simply needed the right provocation to deploy it. They had provided that provocation in a glass-walled conference room on the 9th floor of a building on Main Boulevard, in the form of a laugh and a word.
Ghost.
Ghosts, in my experience, are only frightening when they finally decide to make themselves known. I had made myself known. Now I waited, quietly, patiently, unhurried, for them to come to me. They were already on their way. The fallout didn't explode. It stalled. That was the first sign things had shifted. The SEC hold froze everything. The restructuring, the new investor entry, the internal share adjustments. What had been presented as a nearly finalized deal, valuing the holding group at 340 million rupees, was suddenly suspended in a quiet, clinical pause. No announcements. No celebrations. Just silence. And silence in business is expensive. The external investors pulled back immediately. Not out of fear, but discipline. They wanted clarity. Ownership clarity. Authority clarity. Paper clarity. And for the first time, my name entered the conversation. Not as a footnote. Not as family. Not as an assumption. As a principle. NR Capital's stake had to be formally acknowledged. There was no workaround anymore, no internal adjustment that could override documented filings. My diluted shares, quietly minimized over time, were legally restored with written confirmation. Every percentage point accounted for. Every signature scrutinized. The two cousins who had signed the misrepresentation filings weren't shouted at. They weren't disowned. They were flagged. Compliance review. Internal and external. The kind that doesn't need raised voices to end careers. And the deal, the big one, the 340 million rupees valuation everyone had been orbiting around, could not move forward without one final requirement. My sign-off. That was when they called me back. Not to argue. To negotiate. And I did. Not emotionally. Not personally. Not with any trace of what had happened behind the scenes. I walked into that room as what they had tried to erase. And failed. An owner. I didn't dismantle the company. I didn't burn anything down. Destruction is loud. It attracts attention. It creates chaos. I wasn't interested in chaos. I wanted structure. So I asked for three things. Formal board representation, documented, binding, and immediate. A written apology from Tariq, not symbolic, not verbal, but recorded. And a buyout offer. At fair valuation. based on the same numbers they had confidently shown to outside investors.
No discounts.
No adjustments.
Reality.
They agreed faster than I expected.
Not because they wanted to, because they had to.
I didn't rush the exit. I didn't celebrate it either. I signed when I was ready, on my timeline, with terms that reflected not just what I owned, but what I had endured to prove it. And then I left.
Cleanly.
No noise. No statements. No looking back. Just a transfer. A confirmation. A final acknowledgement. For the first time since the company existed, my name was on record. There's something people misunderstand about being overlooked. They think it makes you weak. Invisible. Easy to replace. But invisibility, if you learn how to use it, becomes leverage. Because when people underestimate you, they stop tracking you carefully. They make assumptions. They cut corners. They reveal patterns they would otherwise hide. And over time, those patterns become evidence. I didn't win because I fought harder. I won because I stayed quiet long enough to understand exactly where the structure was weak, and then chose the right moment to apply pressure. That's not revenge. Revenge is emotional. It's reactive. It wants to hurt. This wasn't about hurting anyone. It was correction. A recalibration of truth, ownership, and accountability. And maybe that's the part that stays with me the most. Not the money, not the apology, not even the exit, but the realization that being underestimated isn't a disadvantage. It's a long-term position. You just have to know when to stop being invisible. And when you do, you don't need to be loud. You just need to be undeniable. If you've ever felt overlooked, dismissed, quietly written out of something you helped build, just remember, silence doesn't mean absence. Sometimes, it's strategy. The first formal meeting request came on day 9. Not from Tarek directly. That would have required a kind of humility that I don't think came naturally to him, at least not yet. It came through his attorney, a man named Rashid Kawar, who had a respectable enough corporate practice in Lahore and who had, I suspected, spent the previous 9 days telling Tarek things Tarek did not want to hear. The request was professionally worded. It proposed a without prejudice meeting between legal representatives to discuss a possible resolution framework. Without prejudice. Meaning, what gets said in the room cannot be used against either party later. I read the request. I called Assad. He said, "They want a quiet exit from this. They're scared." I said, "Good. But we don't meet on their timeline. Counter with 2 weeks from Thursday. That's almost 3 weeks out." "Yes," I said. We countered with 2 weeks from Thursday. They accepted within 4 hours. In the intervening weeks, 3 things happened that I had anticipated and 1 that I hadn't. The first, Mr. Farouk and Mr. Sethi formally withdrew from the restructuring process. Not permanently. They made clear through Assad's back-channel communication with their associate that they remained interested in the asset portfolio in principle. But they would not commit capital to a structure with an unresolved material dispute at its core. They were professional about it. They simply stopped. The 340 million rupees deal, the one that would have finalized my erasure and brought in outside capital under terms that left me with no governance rights and limited economic participation, was for now dead on the table. I learned this on a Monday morning. I was eating toast. I noted it and moved on. The second, the SEC's preliminary review returned an initial finding that the Form A reclassification of NR capital status had been made without documented principal consent and that the post-meeting resolutions from 2021 appeared to have procedural irregularities that warranted further examination. This was not a final ruling. SECP reviews move at their own pace, and the full process would take months. But the preliminary finding was now on official record. It meant that any future transaction involving the holding company would carry that notation. Every bank, every investor, every counterparty doing due diligence would see it. The family's clean corporate record, the thing Tarek had spent 20 years carefully maintaining because he understood, correctly, that reputation as infrastructure in Pakistani business, now had a visible crack running through it. The third, Zain Services Company, the one registered 8 months before the 2021 meeting, the one that had been quietly extracting a management fee from the holding vehicle's revenues before distribution, was flagged in Assad's document request response as a related party transaction that had not been disclosed in the annual returns. Related party non-disclosure is a specific regulatory sensitivity. Assad filed a supplementary note to the SECP referencing it. Zain, I was told by Hira in a brief and carefully worded phone call, had retained his own attorney separately from his father's. The family, in other words, was no longer a unified front. It had begun to fragment along the precise fault lines that had always existed beneath the surface. Tariq protecting Tariq, Zain protecting Zain, Bilal trying to protect both and succeeding at neither. The thing I hadn't anticipated. Hira called me on a Sunday evening, 12 days after the SECP filing. She was not calling on anyone's behalf. She was calling as herself, the cousin who had always spoken to me like a full human being, who had been mortified at the signing dinner in 2019, who had spent the past 12 days watching her family's careful architecture develop visible cracks. She said, "Nadia, I just want you to know that I think what they did was wrong. I've thought that for a long time. I should have said it louder." I was quiet for a moment. "You said it now," I told her. "That matters." It was a short call. We didn't discuss strategy or documents or the meeting with the lawyers. We talked for 22 minutes about other things: her daughter's school, a restaurant in Gulberg we had both been meaning to try, the particular exhaustion of watching people you love behave badly and being unable to stop them. When we hung up, I sat for a while with the specific feeling of that conversation, the warmth of it, the cleanness. Not everything about this story was cold. I want you to know that. The meeting with the lawyers happened on a Thursday afternoon in a neutral conference room at Assad's firm. I attended. Tariq attended. Rashid Kawar attended for Tariq. Assad sat beside me. Bilal came and sat against the wall, slightly behind his father, in the posture of a man who is present because he was told to be and wishes he weren't. Zain did not attend. His own attorney had apparently advised against it given the related party matter still under SECP examination. Tariq looked older than he had in the boardroom 3 weeks earlier. Not dramatically. He is not a man who shows things dramatically. But there was something in the set of his jaw, a tightness around the eyes, that I recognized as the specific fatigue of a person who has been sleeping poorly because they cannot stop running calculations. He looked at me across the table with an expression I had not seen on him before. Not quite remorse. Not quite respect. Something in between. The look of a man recalibrating in real time, filing away a version of you that does not match the one he had been carrying for 11 years. Rashid Kawar spoke first as agreed. He outlined what the family was proposing: formal acknowledgement of NR Capital's active shareholder status, restoration of the original strategic investor classification in all SECP filings, and a good faith discussion about the 2021 resolutions. I let him finish. Then I looked at Assad and nodded once. Assad spoke for 11 minutes. He was precise, unhurried, and thorough in the way that costs 45,000 rupees an hour and is worth every rupee. He outlined what NR Capital required, not requested, required, for any resolution to proceed. 1. Formal restoration of the strategic investor classification, filed with the SECP within 14 days with NR Capital's countersignature. 2. The 2021 resolutions, the asset revaluation and the fee structure approval, to be formally rescinded and rerun under the correct procedures, with proper notice and NR Capital's participation. 3. An independent third-party audit of all revenues and distributions from the holding vehicle for the period during which Zain Services Company had been receiving management fees, with any amount found to have been extracted in excess of what a properly disclosed and consented arrangement would have permitted to be reimbursed to the holding vehicle. 4. A written acknowledgement, signed by Tariq as the company's managing director, that the procedural errors of the past 3 years had occurred and that NR Capital's rights as a material shareholder had not been properly honored. And 5. This one was mine, not Assad's, and I had added it to the list at 11 p.m. the night before the meeting, not out of emotion but out of a clear sense of what the record needed to show. A board seat. 1. Formal. Documented. With the governance rights commensurate to a 34.7% stakeholder. Rashid Kawar made a sound that was not quite an objection and not quite an acceptance. He asked if we could take a short break. We took 20 minutes. Assad and I sat in a smaller room down the hall and said very little. He refilled his water. I checked 2 unrelated emails. When we went back in, Tariq was sitting slightly differently, forward, elbows on the table, the posture of a man who has made a decision and is now simply working out how to deliver it with the least possible damage to his sense of himself. He looked at me directly for the first time since the meeting started. He said, "The board seat. I want to discuss the structure of it." Not. I reject it. Not. This is unreasonable. The structure of it. I said, "That's fine. Let's discuss it." The final agreement was signed 6 weeks later. All 5 points were honored. The SECP filings were corrected. The 2021 resolutions were formally rescinded. Zayn's management fee arrangement was unwound, and the independent audit found 4.3 million rupees in fees that had been extracted beyond what a properly consented structure would have permitted. That amount was returned to the holding vehicle. Zayn settled separately and quietly, as people tend to do when their own attorney is advising them to minimize exposure.